So the National Command Council on Coronavirus are briefing the country today on stage or level 3 rather of the reduced alert level here in South Africa. The practicalities, the logistics behind that. You saw just a moment ago the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security cluster briefing the public on what is applicable. Earlier on, you had a briefing by including among others the COCTA Minister Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, where the issue of alcohol sales and the ban on tobacco still remaining, also being outlined, the issue of schools, transportation, etc. But let's talk about some of these issues with Angelo Fick, Director of Research at ASRI. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Angelo. I want to start with the issue of the alcohol sales versus tobacco ban. I mean, it's still a huge bone of contention, source of much debate. You've had the political parties respond to it today. The EFF's CIC saying he really doesn't understand. If you're going to lift the ban on alcohol, why not do the same with tobacco? We know that the committee itself has submitted a 4,000-page submission on why keep the ban on tobacco. But the political parties are saying there's still no scientific evidence on this. What are your thoughts?
So I think what will happen is that the court system will have to work out exactly how convincing the evidence is that is being submitted by the NCCC. But I think the multiple contradictions inside the regulations, not in terms of the larger logic behind the lockdown and the different levels, but in the minutiae of these individual regulations on particular products, those will be tested by various stakeholders and sectors in societies challenging to them. Not least of those will be the regulations on these prohibited products like tobacco and the allowed products like alcohol, but also in terms of the gatherings and the allowance of religious organizations to open their particular places of worship, while other places of gathering will be, not covered by these regulations. And so one suspects that there will be many, many challenges in the days ahead to government's regulations.
These various pressure groups, are they just trying their luck or do they have a point? Earlier on, the EFF suggesting that there's actually big money behind this, saying that contrary to what people may think, that keeping the ban on tobacco sales benefits the big conglomerates. He mentioned BAT in particular, speaking about those who are in the illicit tobacco trade, saying that they are, in fact, the ones who are being disadvantaged by the continued ban, that there's a far bigger, murkier picture behind the scenes. Is that pushing the envelope too far, or is there a lot that we don't see happening behind the scenes?
So the complex relationships between corporations and politics in South Africa is one that I think has been problematic for many people for a while now. This will not be new. So the relationship between various corporate entities and political parties is not made clear to South Africans because of the nature of legislation on political party funding. The second problem, of course, is also that the ways in which the interests of politicians in terms of funding or money and the interests of corporations have been a dance that has been danced in Southern Africa for at least a century. This is something that I think many South Africans are often only confronted by in these moments of spectacular crisis. But the tobacco companies, the alcohol companies aren't alone in this. The mining sector has been able to get their way by having their mines opened earlier than any other sector, and the argument there was that they were essential to economic activity. And that had to do with the percentage of GDP that they were responsible for and the number of workers that were affected. We've seen the consequences of that with at least one mine having a huge number of COVID-19 infections. And so the ways in which politics and economics does its dance, I think, will be shown in the days ahead, in the weeks ahead. And so my daughter Fikeni pointed out a few days ago, with municipal elections projected for next year and with the general elections for 4 years from now, there are going to be increasing tensions between what these corporations want and which politicians, political parties and organizations they imagine will deliver it for them if they put pressure on them.
I want to go to a point that was also acknowledged by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma earlier on, in the precursor to the press briefing, acknowledging the fact that the WHO has cautioned South Africa against going down to level 3, saying that the figures are not bearing fruit in terms of what we're trying to do. But there's the issue of the economy. We know that political parties have also been agitating for an opening up of the economy. It all comes down, though, to public trust and how much is that being eroded by these political power play that we've seen. The issue of e-commerce, for instance, was pointed to when donations were made by certain companies, saying that it seems that there's undue influence. Is it undue? Is it just part of the game?
I think if one thinks of a democracy as a society in which the majority of citizens get to determine what happens in their name and by what regulations they live, there are some concerns that are very valid about how certain sectors of society and stakeholders that may be a minority in number actually get to influence policy making in a way that is counter to the basic tenets of democracy. And we've seen the extreme examples of this in places like the United States. And there is sort of political organizations in South Africa that suggest that we should move towards such a model where those who have get to influence policy for those who do not have. And the politics of money and the politics of accountability are then in direct clash. We do need to be careful, though, of constructing conspiracy theories, but we also need to bear in mind at the same time that politicians increasingly have not just dual loyalties, but multiply split loyalties. And this was foregrounded in a Constitutional Court judgment where Chief Justice Mogoeng pointed out during the secret ballot judgment that the way in which elected political officials are accountable to their parties, and this accountability may sometimes clash with their accountability to their constitutional oath and to their electorate. This, I think, is something that will have to be worked out in the weeks and months ahead.
And obviously at the center of that is that social compact that the state must have with its citizenry. So if we're talking about national consensus within the background of COVID-19 here in South Africa, would you say there is clearly national consensus? And how vulnerable is it to those social and political dynamics?
I think it's very optimistic to want some kind of stable social compact in the most unequal society on earth. And while people may profess a certain kind of trust in government, the historical record of the number of protests against government, the number of petitions against government actions that go back to 1994. So the post-apartheid dispensation has not necessarily fostered greater trust that people have in social institutions, and particularly in the government institutions that form part of those social institutions. Just at the level of education, for example, the idea that one should believe that educating oneself will give one a better chance in an economy that is riven with corruption, cronyism, and particular kinds of patronage networks is, I think, something that ordinary people already disbelieve, which is why we have, among other things, the huge rates of dropout and the kinds of cynical politics playing out on at the ground level for many, many people. And so this idea that prior to this crisis we had a good social compact and South Africans merely trusted the institutions of their society, I think that there is some evidence that people profess that and believe that, and then there is the evidence of their conduct over the last 25 years that shows just how weak that is. And then with the divisions of class, race, and region, it's often visible where those tensions lie, that the compact is not as strong as we could have made it over the last 25 years.
We do have on the line now, or on Skype, Dr. Sthembile Mbete, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Sthembile.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd like to hear your point of view of how you read the social and political dynamics, especially within the various messaging and policy decisions that have been taken by government. It always emphasizes that it is in consultation, but I was asking Angelo here whether or not we can say there is a national consensus on how government is handling it, and what would that be to your mind?
Look, I think that we even before COVID-19, we lived in a fairly low trust society where there was very little trust between different members of society and different groups within our society, and not a great deal of trust of government and government institutions, and certainly also not much trust of corporations, for example, or trust between capital and labor. And I think that we're just seeing those dynamics playing out in the context of COVID-19 as well. That small window of time that we had in early March or mid-March, when it seemed as though there was some unity in the country, was obviously unsustainable, and we've seen that fall away. And I think that what now a lot of the questions that are being asked are about who actually has government's ear of all of these different groups that government says it is consulting with, and that the different lobby groups, whether they are from industry or whether they're from broader society, who exactly is it that government is listening to, and are they listening to those people over the collective interest of the citizens of the country? And I think it's all of those questions are surfacing, but they're not new questions. I think they are a part and a parcel of the fractured nature of South African politics since 1994.
So government was very clear that its decision has been informed by two major things, and that is the rate of infections and also government's health system readiness. So people have read some cynicism into this, saying it's not really about caring about the people, it's about government's readiness to handle the number of deaths, as in the public health system in itself. Then there is a very emphatic rally from the ministers itself, especially on breaking the laws, that if anybody is found to be doing that, that they must be swiftly dealt with. I'd like to bring in the Collins Khoza issue in just a moment, or right now, and that is, we've seen that there's been an inquiry which has absolved SANDF members, saying that they had nothing to do with his death, that they're not liable. How does that impact on the public trust, especially also including the sale of alcohol? The township vendors had to lobby government to include them when they felt that the big business or the more affluent structures were already given free fall with releasing the ban on the sale of alcohol.
Well, I think that, so there's a number of aspects of the question. So to deal with the immediate one about the alcohol ban, I think that what's clearly emerged from government's response to COVID-19 is how little government understands about the informal economy. Despite all of the information about it in various State of the Nation addresses, the government really has very little understanding of how the majority of people in the country actually make an income and subsist informally. And so it has not been able to make regulations that account for the formal lobby groups and formal industry, and for those who are informal. And we've seen, I think, that the alcohol ban is a classic case of it, because they are not, that they have not been automatically been able to accommodate taverns and shebeens and other such places. In relation to the Collins Khoza issue, I think that is just a reinforcement of the low trust that people have in institutions. And certainly there was an expectation that there was going to be some kind of whitewashed investigation about Mr. Khoza's death and the role of the SANDF and SAPS within that death. And all that report that we've seen has done is confirm those suspicions and confirm the sense that when they have to, our police and our defense force will protect each other and themselves above protecting the citizenry. And I think that, obviously South Africans have a distrust of the defense force. We saw the kind of suspicions and the panic that people had at the beginning of the lockdown when they heard that there was going to be a deployment of the army. And this seems to only confirm those suspicions that people had. So that the idea that you can't rely on the armed forces to hold themselves accountable, I think many people will feel has only been confirmed by the report that was released yesterday. And a lot is going to have to be done to rebuild people's trust, firstly in the investigative process itself. We heard Minister Mapisangakula today say that this process isn't over. She expressed surprise at the report having been released in the first place and said that there is a whole other process of investigation still undergoing. But this has definitely dented public trust and goodwill in the enforcement mechanisms that government is using around this lockdown.
Angelo, just continuing along the theme of the politicization of COVID-19, we've seen various sectors of society jump on the bandwagon. And I'd like to put the messaging of what government is trying to do with this lockdown level 3. All of these messages obviously land on different communities with different circumstances, and that influences their attitudes and their behavior. Taking all of this into account, what are we likely to see just descending down to level 3, and whether or not we will ultimately be able to keep not only the numbers steady, as in flattening the curve? Government has said we've seen evidence of that. Is that going to happen, given, as I said, the politicization of COVID-19, the messaging, which some have said has been garbled, mangled, depending on from which quarters it comes from?
So I think firstly one needs to clarify what is meant by the epidemiologists when they say flattening the curve. They don't mean delete from existence any kind of infection. What they suggest is that instead of having a spike of infections that exceed the ability of your health facilities to deal with people's illnesses, what you've done is you've delayed the way in which the disease spreads and thereby given yourself time to prepare the health system to deal with infections. And so the trade-off there was, do you have a shorter term period of infection with a higher number of infections and a possibly higher number of deaths because you don't have the facilities or materials to deal with the ill? Or do you lengthen the period and thereby flattening the graph and the curve on the graph in order to make sure that you give yourself enough time to deal with that highest number of possible infections? And that, I think, is what will be tested in the months ahead. And one cannot know at this point whether government, and it's not just government, whether this society will be able to cope with it. Secondly, there's also been a misunderstanding that somehow if we go into lockdown, we're not going to see infections. And what the epidemiologists like Professor Abdul Karim has pointed out is that there will be infections, that this disease will move locally the way it has in other places, but that the lockdown and the extension give us time as a society to prepare our institutions for this. Now, the health department is one such institution. But there are other institutions that have to be prepared, including the institutions like the family, like religion, because the amount of suffering that is coming our way is unavoidable. And we will have to prepare ourselves to be resilient, to help people mourn, to help people recover, to deal with children who are orphaned, to deal with the loss of people's resilience in dealing with the amount of mourning in their families. So it's not just about the numbers of people who will die, because for each person who will die, there are going to be numbers of people affected by that deaths who will have a very different response as human beings in a society riven with this. And we've lived through a version of this by looking at KwaZulu-Natal in the 1990s with those massacres, and in the late 90s and 2000s with the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So we have some lessons to learn from history in order to prepare ourselves for this particular instantiation. And it would be naive to assume that this is all simply going to go away because we've had a lockdown.
And Sthembile, that will all be influenced by how much people believe they will be able to endure the consequences of COVID-19. Various sectors are not being singled out for opening. If you speak to hairdressers, nail technicians, for instance, they believe that they already take enough precautions, that they should be allowed to be back onto the economic activity band. What are your thoughts going forward, how government is going to handle this? Because you'll find that some people are already behaving as if they're already in level 3 because they feel they cannot endure this any longer.
Look, I think that...
Well, I think people also...
Okay, Sthembile, you answer first and then Angelo will come back to you.
Oh, okay. I think that the point that Angelo makes is a very important one about what the lockdown was actually meant to achieve, and was really just to prepare the system and to prepare us as people for what is going to come once the virus spreads widely. I think the other thing that was meant to do is to prepare people in terms of their own behaviors and behavioral changes. And what we've seen in South Africa, in contrast, for example, to the United States, which I think is a pretty big outlier in this sense, is that there has been a wide adoption of wearing masks. For example, people are carrying sanitizer. People are expecting to need to sanitize before entering public places. And those kinds of behavioral changes, I think, are going to be very important about how the virus spreads as we go on. I think that for the industries that you're talking about, for the hairdressers, for nail technicians, I think that, the limited way in which government is engaged with those people is seriously problematic and very egregious, considering that the majority of the people that make a living in those sectors are Black women, and do so in an informal sense. And because they have not been able to get together the kind of lobbies we've seen for alcohol and other things, they aren't being heard.
Thank you so much. And Angela, I'm sorry that we have run out of time and we can't come back to you. But thank you very much to both Angelo Fick, Director of Research, ASRI, and Dr. Sthembile Mbete, Senior Lecturer at University of Pretoria. We're taking a quick break. Back with your top stories in just a moment.